It was a Saturday morning in Columbus, Ohio. The marketplace parking lot, Morse Road, October, carts rattling in the wind. Matt Hartwell was 3 spaces from his car when he noticed the woman with the locked cart. White hair, quilted jacket, 2 full bags on each arm, trying to work the frozen wheel free with her foot. Not asking for help, but not refusing it either. He walked over. 1 pull. Done. She thanked him. He started loading her bags into the trunk of her sedan. They talked while he worked, light, ordinary. He handed her a carton of milk that was sliding off the top. 2 rows over, a black Audi pulled in. A woman stepped out in a red blazer, arms crossing when she read the scene. Matt looked up. Across 20 yards of open asphalt, he saw her face. He knew exactly who she was. He looked back down, lifted the last bag into the trunk, steady. The woman in the red blazer was already walking toward them. Stay with this one. What happens in the next few minutes will set something in motion, something that neither of them will be able to walk back from, or want to. Matt Hartwell had lived in Columbus his whole life, except 2 years in Cincinnati right after college that he didn't really count because he'd spent most of them driving back on weekends. He was 38 years old. He had a 10-year-old son named Owen, a second-floor apartment off Carl Road with 2 mini ship models on the kitchen table, and a job that started at 5 in the morning and ended when the dock was clear. That last part was new. For 12 years before that, he had been regional operations director at Creston Logistics, not a title that turned heads at a dinner party, but the kind of job where the work was real and the consequences of getting it wrong were equally real. 37 drivers. Routing systems covering 4 counties. A formal commendation from Creston's CEO in 2021 for a route efficiency project that cut delivery times across the whole regional network and saved the company $1.2 million over 18 months. He had built that from a spreadsheet and 3 conversations in a conference room. He hadn't talked about it much because that wasn't how he was built, and it hadn't needed to be talked about for it to matter. His wife Karen had died 4 years ago. Route 33, a Tuesday in November, a driver who ran a red light doing 52 miles an hour. Owen had been 6. Matt had not fallen apart in any way that other people could see, which meant most people assumed he was fine, and he let them assume that because the alternative required a conversation he didn't have room for. 6 months ago, Creston Logistics had been absorbed by Meridian Supply Group in what a slide deck described as a strategic integration. There had been an all-hands call. A woman Matt had never met stood in a conference room in a live stream and walked through a list of roles being consolidated. His name was on page 47. He got a call from HR, 2 weeks' notice, and a severance packet. He didn't fight it. Owen was 9 at the time, starting 4th grade. And Matt was not a man who spent energy on things he couldn't change when there was a kid at home who needed dinner on the table and a parent at pickup. That had been the whole of the calculation, and it was enough. The distribution center job came through Phil Darroch, who had worked Creston's loading dock until a back injury moved him into supervision. Phil had seen Matt's name on the application, called him directly, and hired him without a long process or an uncomfortable conversation about where the application had come from. The shift started at 5 in the morning and was done by early afternoon, which meant Matt was free by 2:30 and could pick Owen up from school himself. He hadn't needed any other reason. Owen was not a complicated kid. He liked building ship models, specifically the ones with small hull pieces that took patience and a steady hand, the kind where rushing it meant starting over. And he had a habit of knowing things without making a show of knowing them. He had Karen's eyes and Matt's way of waiting before he said something. This particular Saturday, Owen was at a birthday party for a kid named Marcus who lived 3 blocks over. Matt had gone to the marketplace alone. Groceries, 20 minutes, back before noon. Margaret Whitfield was 73 years old, and she had been shopping at this particular marketplace for 11 years because it was 4 minutes from her house on Indianola Avenue, and the produce section was considerably better than the one at the store nearer to her. She had been widowed for 6 years. She had 1 daughter, Rachel, who called 3 times a week and showed up in person on the days she said she would, which Margaret considered one of the more undervalued forms of love. She accepted Matt's help without making a production of it, because she was old enough to know that making a person feel burdensome for offering kindness was its own form of unkindness. They talked while he loaded. She asked if he shopped here often. He said most Saturdays. She said the produce made the extra 5 minutes worth it. He said he'd come to the same conclusion. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask his. Rachel Whitfield was VP of Operations at Meridian Supply Group. She had told her mother she would be there at 10. It was 10 minutes past when she turned into the lot, because her mornings started early even on weekends, and even arriving 10 minutes late to a parking lot on a Saturday registered somewhere in her chest as a small failure she should not have allowed. She parked, stepped out, and saw a stranger loading her mother's car. Her first read lasted about half a second before she corrected it. He was clearly helping. Her mother was talking to him. Nothing was wrong. But something about his face at that distance didn't settle quite the way a stranger's face should settle. She couldn't place it. She kept walking. Rachel reached the car. Her mother turned and said, with genuine warmth, that this was the young man who had helped with the cart. Matt looked at Rachel once. It was not a long look. It was the kind that takes in a person and then moves on, except that his eyes held for a beat longer than a stranger's should before he stepped back and said it was no trouble. She said, "Thank you," professional, a little clipped, still orienting to the scene. She handed her mother the reusable bags she'd brought from the back seat, and when she looked up, he was already walking away. No hesitation, no backward glance, no waiting to see if there was anything more. Margaret watched him go. She said, "He didn't even let me thank him properly." Rachel watched him get into a 5-year-old Accord and pull out of his space. She had the specific, brief sensation of almost placing someone and then losing the thread before it resolved. She filed it in the part of her mind that holds things with no immediate action required. She forgot about it before she reached the store entrance. Matt drove home. Owen was back by noon, still wearing the paper birthday hat Marcus's mother had apparently insisted on, carrying it on his head with the resigned dignity of someone who has decided to see the thing through. They made sandwiches. They spent most of the afternoon working on the tugboat hull, small pieces, Matt holding the frame while Owen applied the glue, neither of them talking much because they didn't need to. Matt did not mention the parking lot. The following Monday morning, Rachel was at her desk by 7. Greg Foss stopped by before the stand-up with a manila folder and the slightly too settled posture of a man who has already decided how a conversation is going to go. He set the folder on her desk and explained it was a complaint from Hartfield Foods, a billing discrepancy from the previous quarter, already corrected, just wanted her in the loop. She read the top sheet, signed the acknowledgement form he'd brought, and handed it back. He took the folder and left. Her assistant flagged it an hour later. The Hartfield account was large enough to trigger a 30-day internal review under standard protocol. It wasn't optional. Rachel acknowledged the flag, moved it into her workflow, and turned to the next item. The clock started, quietly, without ceremony, the way most things that matter do. Phil Darroch gave Matt a written commendation that week for reorganizing the staging area on his own initiative, without being asked and without making an announcement about it. The old configuration put the heaviest pallets at the far end of the dock, which added roughly 4 minutes to every load cycle. Matt had looked at it for a week and then spent one afternoon moving things until they were where they should have been. Phil wrote it up and put it in the file. Matt said it wasn't a big deal. Phil said, "It is to the guys pulling the second shift." And that was the end of that. On Thursday of the same week, Matt stopped for gas on the way home and ran into Dennis at the pump next to his. Dennis had been a driver at Creston, one of the 37. He did a double take that wasn't particularly subtle about itself. They talked for 5 minutes with their engines running, the way men talk when they haven't planned to see each other but don't want to make the accidental meeting odd by cutting it short. Dennis said the old Creston team was scattered. A few had landed at other logistics firms. 2 were suing over wrongful termination. Most had just moved on the way people do when there's nothing else to be done. He said he'd heard Matt had landed somewhere, but hadn't known it was here. Matt said it was fine. Good hours. Dennis nodded in the particular way that means he understood more than he was going to say about it, and they went their separate ways. That evening, Owen had a science fair project due the following week, something about how water temperature affects the rate at which salt dissolves. They spent an hour at the kitchen table cutting the backing board to size and measuring panels, Owen narrating the methodology while Matt handed him tape when he needed it. The project was thorough. Owen had thought it through without being prompted. Karen's photograph was on the bookshelf in the living room. It always was, in the same spot, in the same frame. Matt did not look at it more on some nights than on others. It was simply there the way the furniture was there, present and unremarkable, which was the only way he knew how to keep it without it becoming something that required managing. After Owen was asleep, Matt read for an hour. He still subscribed to 2 logistics trade publications out of an old habit he'd never gotten around to breaking. One of them carried a brief item on Meridian Supply Group's second quarter performance, strong growth, acquisitions performing above forecast, expanded footprint across the Midwest region. He read the paragraph once. He closed the laptop. Rachel opened the Hartfield follow-up packet on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of the review window. Her assistant had compiled the invoice logs into a single document, routine desk work, the kind of thing that should take 15 minutes before the next meeting. She was on the 3rd page when she stopped. One line item from November didn't match a delivery confirmation she had from a separate December audit. The dollar amounts were close enough that it might be a rounding variance or a database lag, but not close enough for Rachel to feel comfortable closing the file. She had spent 10 years in operations learning that billing discrepancies almost never turned out to be nothing when you looked harder at them. They tended to turn into something, and the something was almost never good news. She sent the relevant section to Greg with a note and a question mark. He called her within 20 minutes. He explained it as a legacy system issue. The Creston database hadn't been fully reconciled with Meridian's platform before the integration cut over, and some records were still populating from the old source in ways that didn't align cleanly with the new one. He'd run a manual reconciliation and get it to her by end of week. His voice was practiced, the voice of a person who has explained complicated things to skeptical audiences enough times to know how to make the explanation sound like the complete answer. She said fine. She'd look for his reconciliation. She moved the email thread to a separate folder instead of archiving it. It was a habit she'd developed over the years. Threads that felt unresolved in a way she couldn't name went into their own space, where she'd see them again. Greg, back at his desk, opened Matt Hartwell's personnel file on his computer. Termination date confirmed. December. Processed. He closed the tab. That Thursday evening, Rachel met her mother for dinner on High Street. They were halfway through their meals when Margaret brought up the man from the parking lot. Not because anyone had asked, just because Margaret mentioned things that had stayed with her. She said, he didn't want anything for it. That's rarer than people think. Rachel said she was sure he was just being polite. Margaret looked at her with the specific patience of someone who had been polite for 73 years and understood precisely the distance between that and what she was describing. Rachel changed the subject. On the drive home, the thought came back. The way he had looked at her once, direct, without trying to extend it or make anything of it. Most people either looked away too fast or not fast enough. He had done neither. She couldn't do anything useful with that, so she let it go. The 30-day follow-up on the Hartfield complaint produced a second irregularity, and this one was not explainable as a database lag. A vendor called Harlan Supply Company had billed Meridian at a rate 15% above the contracted rate across 6 consecutive invoices. The aggregate overcharge was $74,000. That was not a rounding error. It was not a formatting issue. It was not a reconciliation artifact from a messy migration. $74,000 in excess billing over 6 invoices had gone somewhere, and Rachel needed to know where. She pulled Greg into her office on a Wednesday morning and closed the door. She laid the invoices on the desk. He looked at them without picking them up, which told her something. He said the Creston procurement team had maintained a separate informal arrangement with Harlan that predated the acquisition, a pricing structure that was understood on both sides, but hadn't been formally documented in the main contract, and which was supposed to be renegotiated when Meridian took over the account. It hadn't been. He'd take care of it. She asked him to pull the original Creston procurement contract with Harlan and send it to her by end of day. He said he'd have to dig for it. The Creston archive had been migrated by a third-party contractor, and the directory wasn't clean. She said that was fine. She would have legal pull it directly from the source documents on their end, which would be faster. The change in his posture was small and controlled. He straightened the invoices, aligned them with the edge of the desk, and set them back down. He said that worked. She watched him leave. She then scheduled a comprehensive audit of the Harlan account going back 18 months and sent the request to legal herself, directly, with a note that she needed the original Creston Harlan contract pulled from source. That same afternoon, Phil mentioned to Matt that someone from Meridian Corporate had been through the dock that morning. An operations review of some kind, he assumed. She had walked the whole staging area, asked a handful of specific questions, and written things down. Mid-30s, dark hair, red blazer, didn't say much beyond what she was there for. Matt asked what she looked like. Phil described her, more specifically this time. Matt said that was probably just routine oversight and went back to the pallet he was moving. But he spent the rest of the shift thinking about it, turning it over without reaching any conclusion. The name Meridian had been something he could set aside on most days. That was getting harder to do. He was walking to his car at the end of the shift, 2:30, lot half empty, October sun low in the west, when he saw the black Audi pull in. He recognized the car before he recognized her. She stepped out. They were 20 yards apart, and neither of them moved for a moment. She had been heading toward the building entrance. She stopped. He had been heading toward his car. He stopped. There was nothing performed about it. Just two people in a parking lot, suddenly very still. The recognition moved across her face the way these things do, slowly at first, and then all at once, the way a name arrives after you've been trying to remember it for too long. She said, "I know you." He said, "You've seen me before." She said, "The parking lot. Saturday." He said, "Yes." She asked if he worked here. He said he did. She asked his name. He told her. The pause that followed was 3 or 4 seconds. She was running the name through her memory, running it against a list she had signed on page 47 of an integration document 6 months ago, against a face she had never connected to a name until right now, in a distribution center parking lot in October. He watched her get there. He didn't do anything to help her along. She said, "You were at Creston." He said, "I was." She said, I didn't know which people specifically." He said, "I know." He nodded once. He walked to his car. He drove away. She stood in the lot for a moment after the Accord pulled out, one hand resting against the door of the Audi, looking at the space where his car had been. Rachel did not sleep well. The next morning, she was at her desk by 6:30. She went to legal directly, not through Greg, not through the standard request channel, and asked for Matt Hartwell's complete Creston personnel file. It landed in her inbox at 8:45. She read it in full. Then she read it again. 12 years at Creston Logistics. Performance evaluations going back to 2013, every one of them rated strong or exceptional, annotated with specific project outcomes and measurable results. A formal commendation from Creston CEO in 2021 for a route efficiency project that had reduced delivery times across the regional network and saved the company $1.2 million over 18 months. She stopped at that number and read the commendation letter carefully. The project had taken 6 weeks of after-hours work. The CEO had called it the most impactful operations initiative the company had seen in a decade. Then she found the termination justification. One paragraph. Greg Foss's handwriting on a printed evaluation form. Role consolidation in connection with the Meridian integration. Redundant function overlap with Meridian's existing operation structure. That was all. No org chart comparison. No compensation analysis. No documentation of how the evaluation had been conducted or which roles it had been compared against. A single paragraph justifying the elimination of a 12-year career. She pulled Greg's memos for every other Creston role that had been included in the headcount reduction. All of them had supporting material. Org charts, headcount matrices, documented function overlap analyses, some running to 3 and 4 pages. Several had annotated comparisons between the Creston position and the Meridian equivalent. Matt Hartwell's had one paragraph, with no supporting documentation at all. She sat with that for a long time without moving. The Harland audit results arrived at 11. Legal flagged them to HR and the CFO simultaneously. The original Creston Harland procurement contract was in the source documents. Plain, properly executed, unambiguous. The contracted rate was exactly what Meridian had been paying before the overbilling began. There was no informal pricing arrangement. There was no undocumented side agreement. Greg had described something in her office 2 days ago that had never existed, and she had sat across the desk and listened to him describe it. The $74,000 in excess billing had been routed to a vendor rebate account. One authorized signatory on that account. The name on the authorization was Greg Foss. The audit had also flagged a forwarded email from the legal packet, marked contextually relevant. A December communication from Matt Hartwell to Creston's procurement department, noting a billing irregularity on a Harlan supply invoice. The email was detailed and specific. He had attached the invoice itself, the applicable contracted rate schedule, and a one-page analysis laying out the gap between what had been billed and what the contract required. He had asked procurement to review it before the quarter closed. He had done everything right. He had used the correct channel, attached the correct documentation, and sent it to the correct people. He had done it quietly, without escalating it into something that would embarrass anyone, because that was apparently the kind of person he was. 3 weeks later, Greg Foss had submitted his name as redundant. Rachel read the email twice. Then she sat at her desk and was still for a long moment, long enough that someone walking by might have thought she was on a call. She got up. She walked down the hall. She stood outside Greg's office until he ended his call. She went in, closed the door, and set the Harlan audit on his desk with the December email beside it. She said, "Tell me about Matt Hartwell." Greg said the name in the careful way of someone deciding how much to recognize. She said, "Don't." What followed was brief. Greg understood within 3 sentences that there was no version of this conversation that ended in his favor. He stopped talking before she did. She told him she was forwarding the audit and the rebate account documentation to HR and the CFO before end of day, and that he should expect to hear from them shortly. He nodded. She left. The CFO and HR were briefed that afternoon. Rachel laid out the Harlan audit, the rebate account, the December email, and the one-paragraph termination justification side by side, without commentary. She answered 4 questions. The CFO authorized immediate suspension of Greg's access to all systems and company premises pending a full investigation, and legal concurred. Greg Foss was escorted out of the building at 4:57 in the afternoon. Phil Darroch received a call from Meridian's HR department that evening. A reference verification on Matt Hartwell, current performance record, reliability, work quality, general conduct on the job. Phil answered straightforwardly, the way he answered questions about people he had reason to respect. Matt arrived before his shift started, every shift. He did the work and more than the work. The staging reorganization he'd done in week 2 had improved cycle times on every shift since, without anyone asking him to look at it, and without him mentioning he'd done it until Phil found out on his own. HR thanked him. Phil hung up the phone, sat for a moment, and then did not call Matt. He figured Matt would hear what he needed to hear when it was the right time to hear it. Rachel stayed at her desk until 7. She signed off on a vendor renewal contract, reviewed the following week's operation schedule, answered a backlog of emails she'd let accumulate through the afternoon's events. The office floor emptied around her gradually, one desk lamp going dark at a time, until she was the only one left. She took the elevator to the parking garage and sat in the Audi without starting the engine. The termination list from December was still open on her phone. She'd pulled it up earlier in the day and hadn't closed it. 46 names. Page 47. Her signature at the bottom of the authorization block, in the dark blue ink of the pen she kept in her jacket pocket. She had reviewed that list on a Wednesday afternoon 3 weeks into the Creston integration, while managing 4 separate work streams and sitting in a conference room that hadn't had its thermostat fixed since the building changed hands. She had flagged 2 names in IT that she wanted to discuss before signing off. The rest she had trusted to the domain experts who had submitted the evaluations, logistics operations to Greg, who knew that function and had been embedded in the Creston assessment since before the deal closed. None of that was false. Every part of it was accurate. She was sitting in a parking garage at 7 o'clock in the evening looking at her own signature on a document that had separated a man from a career he'd spent 12 years building, a man who had tried to flag something important and been cut out for it. And the accurate parts were not giving her the kind of comfort that accurate parts are supposed to give. She put the phone in her pocket. She drove. She ended up in the marketplace lot on Morse Road. Not entirely by accident. The lot was mostly empty at 7:30 on a weeknight, the store lights warm behind the glass. The same asphalt where all of this had started on a Saturday morning that felt like it belonged to a different month. She sat there for a while with the engine off and her hands resting in her lap. Then she drove home. The next morning, Rachel called Phil Darroch directly. She told him who she was and enough of what had happened to give him the picture without turning it into more than he needed to know. Then she asked for Matt's end-of-shift time. Phil was quiet for a moment. Not a long moment, but a real one. Then he gave it to her. The following afternoon, she was in the distribution center lot at 2:15, leaning against the Audi and waiting. Parking lots had become a theme. She crossed her arms against the October cold and kept her eyes on the building entrance. Matt came out at 2:30. He saw her, and something in the way he was walking shifted very slightly. Not stopping, not slowing, just a small internal adjustment, the way a person moves when something they were expecting arrives. She walked toward him. He walked toward her. They met in the middle of the lot and stopped. She did not open with an apology or with a preface designed to arrange how it would land. She told him what the audit had found: the Harland invoices, the rebate account with his name on the authorization, the December email he'd sent to procurement, and the one-paragraph justification memo with no supporting material that had ended his time at Creston. She laid it out in the sequence it had happened, without reshaping any part of it to make herself look better than she was. Matt stood with his hands in the pockets of his jacket and listened. He did not fill the pauses or move to make the telling easier. She said, "He had you removed because you were about to find what he was doing." He said, "I know." She asked if he had known at the time. He said he'd suspected. The invoice looked wrong. He'd flagged it, and then the termination had come before he could take it further. He hadn't had documentation then. She had it now. There was a pause. Somewhere behind them a truck was backing up to the dock. The October wind moved across the open lot and let go. She said Meridian was prepared to offer him reinstatement. Not his exact Creston title, but an equivalent operations management role within Meridian's structure, the same salary band, and full back pay for the 6 months he'd been out. He looked at it the way he looked at most things, steady, not hurried. He asked if the offer was coming from her or from legal. She said both. "But I'm the one standing here, and legal isn't." He said he'd think about it. She nodded. She'd expected nothing different. She started to turn for the car. Then she stopped. She said, "My mother told me what you did on Saturday." He said, "I loaded some bags." She said you didn't want anything for it." He said, "There wasn't anything to want." She held that for a moment. The truck at the dock finished its approach, and the backup alarm stopped. The lot went quiet. She walked to her car. He stood in place for a moment after she left, looking at nothing in particular, then got into the Accord and drove to pick up Owen from school. That evening they had pasta. Owen talked about a kid in his class named Jordan who had built a model rocket with a genuine igniter, launched it from the baseball field on Saturday, watched it travel 40 feet before tilting sideways and nearly taking out the backstop, and considered the whole thing a success. Owen's assessment was that the lateral drift had been the most interesting part scientifically. Matt listened, asked 2 questions about the igniter, and they finished dinner. He was at the sink when Owen, at the table with a library book, said without looking up, "Did anything happen today?" Matt stood there for a second, hands in the dishwater. He said, "Work stuff. Good news, I think." Owen nodded and turned a page. After Owen was asleep, Matt sat at the kitchen table with the offer letter that Meridian's HR had sent by email at 4 o'clock. He'd opened it in the parking lot after she left, and then not opened it again. He put his phone face up on the table. He was not someone who made decisions by talking himself into them. He made them by sitting still long enough that one option became the only one that made sense, and then he followed it. Karen's photograph was on the bookshelf in the other room. He didn't look at it differently on nights like this. It was just there. He thought about Phil saying, on the day he hired him, that the best decisions he'd ever made were the ones he hadn't overthought. He thought about the staging area on the dock, slower than it had to be, and he'd been unable to leave it that way. He thought about a December email he had written carefully and sent to the right people, because the numbers didn't add up, and he wasn't built to leave numbers that didn't add up alone. He thought about a woman in a parking lot in the afternoon, telling him what she had found, without softening it. He called Phil, left a voicemail, said he'd be in at 5 same as always, but wanted Phil to know first. He was going to take the Meridian offer. He went to check on Owen. The boy was asleep on his side, one arm around the finished tugboat they'd moved to the nightstand after they put the last piece on together. It listed on the curved surface. Matt straightened it, stood in the doorway a moment, one hand on the frame. Then he went to bed. 3 weeks later, on a Monday in early November, Matt started at Meridian Supply Group. The office was in a brick building in the short north. Quieter than the distribution center, different rhythm. His inbox had 11 items when he sat down at 8:15. He worked through them in order, and the work was familiar enough in its bones that the surface newness of the desk and the floor plan wore off inside the first hour. That morning he had dropped Owen at school at 7:40. Owen looked at the button-down shirt and the jacket with the measured seriousness of someone who has opinions and does not give them freely. He said, "You look different." Matt said, "Good different or bad different?" Owen considered this, actually weighed it. He said, "Fine." Then he got out of the car and walked into the building without looking back. Matt sat there a moment before pulling away. At 10:30, Rachel appeared in the open doorway. She knocked on the frame and came in with a folder. She set it on the desk. Harland account closeout documentation. His team would take over the final reconciliation. He opened it, looked at the top sheet. She was already turning for the door. He said, "How's your mother?" She turned back. The question was small, and it was not small, and both of them understood that at the same time. She said, "She's fine." She asked about you. He said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "That you're difficult to read." He looked at her for a beat. She'd know better than that by now. Something shifted, not announced, not large, just a degree of ease that hadn't been there a moment before. She said she'd be around if he had questions on the Harland files. He said he'd figure it out. Then, but I'll let you know. She nodded once and left the doorway. That afternoon he walked the supply chain floor, intake to dispatch. He didn't carry notes. A system tells you more before you try to change it than after. He passed Greg Foss's former office near the end of the corridor, door open, desk cleared, chair pushed in, and kept walking. On Friday, Owen had a half day. Matt picked him up at noon, and they drove to the marketplace. A day early. No reason to hurry. In the produce section, a cart appeared around the end of an aisle, and Margaret Whitfield was pushing it. She saw Matt and stopped. She said, "Matt." He said, "Mrs. Whitfield." She looked at Owen. Matt introduced them. She asked Owen what he was interested in. Owen said ship models. Margaret said she and her husband had built them for years, balsa wood, the kind that required a solid week of evenings and at least one disagreement about where the rigging went. Owen asked what kind of ships. They stood in the produce aisle for 4 or 5 minutes. Margaret told Owen that balsa wood had a grain, and if you cut against it the piece split. You had to learn to feel which direction it ran before you touched it with a knife. Owen said the hull planks on his tugboat had been exactly the same way. She said that was always how it was with the parts that mattered most. When Margaret moved on, she told Matt it was good to properly meet him. He said, "Likewise." Owen looked up at Matt. "She knew your name." Matt said, "We met before." Sort of. Owen thought about this for a full aisle. Then he reached past Matt and put a box of crackers in the cart. They drove home through the short north. A mural slid past on the side of a building. Full wall, layered colors, the kind that takes months and looks like it was always there. Owen said, "Can we come back and look at that sometime?" Matt said, "Sure." They drove on. He didn't know what was next with Rachel. She didn't either. Neither of them was in any rush to name something that wasn't ready to be named. There was a particular ease in knowing the other person understood this, that they were willing to let a thing be what it was. He'd recognized it in her the same way she had recognized it in him, slowly, and then all at once. That was enough for now.